Hi, my name's Ian Wallace. I call myself the Messed Up Counsellor, which is quite an intriguing name. And the podcast you're about to see is one of many, and we've been doing about a year now. So you can look back and see all the things we've talked about with guests and on my own over the process. A lot of the information I use in the podcast initially came from the first book I wrote in 2011. Why do we do that? What do we do about it? And that came out and was the basis of all my learning, understanding at that time, which is going back a few years now. And that process of understanding how the world works for people, how we can alter, change, and adapt it, was kind of what it was there to do with the initial stages. I've made that now an audiobook as well, so it's available on Amazon as an audio file that you can check out and you can download to your heart's content, and hopefully that will be helpful. In the podcasts, we're trying to look at all sorts of things about human interactions, human dynamics, the world, and how we might understand it more or change it more. So it gives you lots of ideas and tools in order to think about and look at different ways of being or dealing with things. And hopefully that brings people together and makes people more able to connect and communicate. Lots of topics. If you ever want to connect to me, just obviously drop me a comment on the podcast and I shall try as much as possible to reply. And if you've got any ideas of things that we might want to use on the podcasts, then please let me know. My name's Ian Wallace. Thanks for looking and thanks for listening. Hi, and welcome to another podcast from Ian Wallace. I was with a client the other day and we were kind of talking about how people who manipulate other people and how they can derive pleasure from somebody else's pain. And I thought that was a really interesting thing maybe to have the focus of the podcast, because it seems to be something that happens quite regularly from a manipulation control. And when I say pain, I don't necessarily mean physical pain with manipulation control. It might be an emotional pain or a mental pain. And obviously pain is different for everybody. So when we go through a process of finding ourselves in a relationship which is manipulative, and that might not be a personal relationship, a love relationship, it could be somebody at work, it could be one of your friends. Manipulation comes in all sorts of different relationships. The reason I think people do that, not because necessarily they want to cause pain, although that might be the case, but they want to create security in their own world and their own life. So manipulated controllers are usually insecure people. They kind of need that world their way. They need it how they see it. And they kind of don't necessarily feel or understand your world or your life or your feelings and emotions around it. When they know what they're doing, when they take pleasure in doing what they're doing, that is different. That will be a much greater manipulation control. And I say, I think we all manipulate or try to gain control. I don't think that's necessarily a horrible person. But if we know somebody is hurting because they've told us, and we still do it, that is a different process. And I think when people derive pleasure from incurring somebody else's pain, it's really hard for us to understand why. We all look at the world through our own lenses, through our own eyes, our own experience. So we try to understand the world from where we are. It's really hard to understand somebody else's world sometimes. I mean, in counselling, we hopefully try to understand everybody's world. And so we can see the reasons for things and why it works the way it does. But if we're in a relationship and that person constantly gives us pain in some way, shape or form, we sometimes don't understand, because it's really hard to kind of get that understanding. So that'll be something people always kind of say to me when we're working with these kind of situations and issues. Says, how does anybody like giving me pain, giving me problems? I think for most people, once they get that process and they can see it, and I try and work it as though it's a game, a horrible game. It's not a nice game. But I think if we can understand it as a game, there is reasons, there is a structure, there is some kind of ultimate goal, we can see it more clearly. It kind of helps us to remove the emotional content of it, which is a reaction. Emotions, we react with emotions. But give it more of a logical, more of a thought process, more of structuring and thinking about the structure. And I think once we do that with clients, we can get them to understand things differently. But until then, it kind of doesn't make sense. It's not what you would do to somebody. It's not how you would see your world. You would not find pleasure in that. But when we have manipulator controllers who know what they're doing and they know they're creating that pain, then having a structure helps us to not just to say understand it, but we also then can start looking at the rules of the game. So what you do when you're with a manipulator controller, it's kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, the old films kind of process. So Dr. Jekyll is that kind of nice, warm, comforting, supplying your needs. And Mr Hyde is what comes out when those needs you're trying to take control of, or you're trying to make their world into your world. So they resist that. They resist that process. And then Mr Hyde appears, the nasty one, the one that derives pleasure. The thing for most people is, once you start explaining it in this kind of way, is that the Dr. Jekyll is always Mr Hyde as well. That's the problem. You get that nice person because you're doing what they want you to do. You're working their world. You're not challenging their world. You're not creating any kind of disruption to it. You're going along with it. So whilst you're going along with it, then naturally, Dr. Jekyll, looking after you, caring about you. There's a very fine line between care and control, which I've talked about in other podcasts, and it's really hard to understand where we are on it unless somebody else tells us this feels like control, or we ask, does this feel like control? So when we're moving through that process, the Dr. Jekyll we get, it's nice. But Mr Hyde is always there. Dr. Jekyll is only there in order for Mr Hyde to have a better life. And people say people switch from Dr. Jekyll to Mr Hyde. Yes, they do, but they're always there in the background. So even though Mr Hyde is there, you don't see them. They don't give you any indication they're there, because you're going along with Dr. Jekyll's world and life. So when you start looking at it in these kind of ways, it makes more sense. It means you can play the game and you can get the outcome. You can offer a manipulator controller to change, and that might be something they can do. But if they don't, then you have to make a choice. And in any decision, there is always three possibilities. Things stay the same, nothing changes. In a relationship, both people change to effect a different outcome, which is obviously the one that you would prefer, or you detach from the process and you leave the relationship. Now, if you don't want things to remain the same, which is usually the case in a manipulative and controlling relationship, then naturally you're going to offer the other person to change. Hopefully you can change as well, and you can create a better outcome. a more communicative outcome, more one that feels much more connected, as shared values, shared goals, all those kind of things. But if that cannot work, then you have to think about that detaching from it. Most people don't want to do that. Most people like to think that they can get the Dr. Jekyll more of the time. But they don't realise that the Dr. Jekyll is only there so that Mr. Hyde has a better life. When we're moving that through that process where we're trying to get people to understand these kind of things, initially we look at the world through, as I've said, our own eyes. So if our experience has been that as we grew up, people made choices for us, people cared about us, they didn't necessarily give us an opportunity to have a voice, not necessarily because they're bad people, but because they wanted to look after us, then we more likely get into relationships that's pretty similar, because that's our normal. That's the way it works. That means we're more prone to get into reducing our boundaries, giving up our needs to other people, to kind of get that process of no conflict, of everything's okay. But when we move into relationships, our own personal relationships, then we find we're more susceptible to manipulated controllers. So what manipulated controllers have to have is boundaries. They need to know that there is a point, that there is a stop, whatever the stop might be. And then we have to have consequences to not keeping our boundaries. But what manipulated controllers do, they push our boundaries. They push our processes, our points, our fixed. We cannot accept that, or we can't do that. Because they want to see that solid, that secure bit, because they are insecure, as I said at the beginning. So as they work that pushing our boundaries, if we give up our boundaries, if we say, oh yeah, don't worry about me, it's okay, yeah, we can do that, yeah, we're all right. If we kind of go down those avenues, then the more they will push, and the more they will need to have that secure boundary. So it's going to create conflict with giving boundaries. Boundaries are not necessarily something that doesn't create conflict in a smaller or larger degree. So having that process of creating the boundary makes everything safe and secure. But it's not how we would normally work our world. It's not our normal. And when it's not our normal, we kind of see it as a threat. We see it as, well, that's different. That's probably not a good thing. But if our normal's always been that somebody takes responsibility for our lives, and we don't have responsibility, we don't have a choice, we don't have a voice, then the more likely is we'll go into these kind of relationships, or we'll find these kind of people around us. Which is why when we talk and share these kind of things with people in the counselling room, once they start thinking about these things in a different way, it's as though the curtains are being drawn apart and they can see all the situation scenarios where in the past they've been manipulated or controlled, or that process has been working. So it's like everywhere. I've seen it everywhere around me. And it's not that you're seeing it for the first time and it's everywhere around you. It's always been there. It's just that maybe you didn't open the curtains. And that process can be really hard on people, because it feels like their whole world is falling apart and they can't survive. And normally they'll go back into those controlling relationships. A statistic years ago that I knew of with Women's Aid, who is a national organisation, they used to say that a manipulate controller, to leave a manipulate controller, it'll take you about 18 times to do so on average. And that was their statistic many years ago. It might have changed now. But if you think for 18 times you've tried to leave and you've gone back on average, then that's a lot of time and effort spent in trying to regain a relationship that actually wasn't a relationship as you would know it. It's not a giving, free love, connection relationship. It's more of a demands and supply. If you're in a relationship like that, then try to see it in this way. Try to see it as a game, as that there is a reason for what they do, a reason that they want their world to be safe and secure, and offer them an opportunity, an alternative to create that boundary, to say, no, actually, that's not what I want. If they accept the boundary, absolutely fantastic. Move forward, create a shared process. If they don't accept it, then you do have to make a choice. I find when I'm working with people who are in domestic violence relationships, which obviously are physical manipulation and control, that they don't necessarily feel as though they deserve anything better. They sometimes feel that they deserve that relationship. And in some senses, that process of how we think about it is that if we kind of think we're allowing this, which is not easy because it's been done to us, but if we can think we're allowing this, it changes the perspective. It means that we're in charge of that process. It gives us power. Which might sound strange, but it does. If we say they're doing this to us, then we lose that power. We lose that energy because we are the victim in it. But if we say we're allowing them to do this, we're taking that and we're controlling it. And then at some point we can say we're not going to allow it, and then it'll change. But if you've got a Dr. Jekyll and a Mr Hyde in one person, then the only way to stop Mr Hyde is to offer Mr Hyde an alternative and say, well, okay, if you want a relationship with me, these are my terms, these are my rules, these are my conditions. And if you respect me and value me, then you'll honour those and you'll validate that. But whatever you do with it, think about it in those kind of terms if you can. And seek help, either from a professional like me, or somebody that has got your best interests at heart, and that they can give you that other view. I always say to people when they're trying to work these things out, because they're not easy things to work out, say, well, if you can't understand it for yourself, think of it this way. If your friend was going through what you're going through, what would you say to your friend? Now, if you can do it in that way, because you can then externalize it onto somebody else, you're probably going to get more of a logical choice of what's okay, what's not okay. But then, if you do that, you have to then do the thing you've given your friend the advice for, which is not easy. Most people in relationships which are manipulative and controlling and they derive pleasure from hurting, they usually get you to a point where you don't have, if you think about it, a choice. You can't change it, you can't alter it. You know, it might be financial control, it might be that the fact that you've got kids, it might be that you don't have the lease in your name or whatever. There'll be some aspect that they've pulled you into that means that you cannot easily leave them, usually. So yes, those are really horrible things to think about as a change, that, you know, I would have to find somewhere to live, or I can't afford the lifestyle I've got, or whatever it is. But you have to then take your own responsibility and say, you're allowing this. That might be helpful. It's a horrible subject to talk about. It's not an easy one to understand, definitely. But I think hopefully this might have given you some ideas. If not for your relationship, maybe for your friend's relationship or family relationship, other people's relationships, to kind of get your head around it. As always, enjoy, subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed this, and share it because you don't know who might need it. Thanks for listening. My name's Ian Wallace. Hi, thanks for listening to the podcast, and hopefully it made sense and was interesting for you. Please subscribe, like and share. With the podcasts, you never know who will be helped by the things we talk about, things we share. We don't normally tell people our problems, but by sharing it and helping other people to understand things. The book Insecurity, It's All About Me, is also available now through Amazon, and it gives you an understanding of what drives insecurity, how insecurity works within our human dynamics, and how you can get a much more secure connection with people. It gives you lots of ideas and thoughts, which is really good. So thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, share, hit the button, and if you've got any comments, please give me them, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks very much. Take care.